Welcome to another episode of Independent Thought and Freedom, where we have conversations with some of the most interesting people around the world who are shaking up politics, society, economies, and ideas. We've had some amazing guests on this program, including The Saker, Paul Craig Roberts, Sheikh Imran Hussein, E. Michael Jones, Cynthia McKinney, and more. If you'd like to support us to reach our next goal of actually putting together live events where we bring some of my best guests side by side on one stage, please consider becoming a monthly subscriber on Patreon. You'll find the link below. Also, if you are an author or researcher with important ideas to share with the world and want to have a greater impact, I'm offering a free masterclass, 3 steps on how to leverage your intellectual authority to become a media personality. The link for that class is in the description as well. And now, on to this week's show. Welcome to Independent Thought and Freedom. The radical LGBTQIA+ movement, their agenda has reached extremes in Western society and its satellites as well, and that these extremes would have been unforeseen just a few years ago. Positions that were once held by people like Barack Obama and Hilary Clinton now are seen as hate speech, and in a frightening display of oppressive and hostile power, which was once ascribed to the anti-communist and Christian right wing, it's now gone to the extreme left. Gay marriage, transgender bathrooms, new non-binary pronouns, general anti-male hostility, and many other ideas that were on the radical fringe once are now accepted policy in many places. What makes this more terrible is the fact that there appears to be little or no freedom to question or to disagree with these policies and the agenda in general. Indeed, most people in the West in particular, even if they don't agree, appear to have been cowed by the bullying of activists. In addition to the leading corporations, media houses, and political parties who may destroy your reputation and career for merely having a different opinion. Worse, if you try to actually advocate for your opposing point of view. Far from being a rebel or an anti-systemic movement, the so-called LGBTQIA+ movement is supported by the most powerful, the largest, and the wealthiest corporations in the world. Thankfully, in the West, there are people who stand up for their freedom of conscience, for their freedom to dissent, and their freedom to organize. One of the most important such organizations is the International Organization of the Family, which dares to stand up for tradition, seeks to promote and protect the family, and to advocate for timeless family values. I'm pleased to have today the president of the IOF, Mr. Brian Brown, on the podcast today. Welcome, Brian.
Thanks for having me.
Right, yeah, it's great to have you here. I understand that you were recently hosted by the president of Moldova.
Yeah, I was in Moldova this summer, and we spent some time with the president of Moldova. We had a World Congress of Families. Every year we have this event that brings together people of different faiths, different backgrounds, different nationalities to unify around the family. And we had 2 years ago our World Congress of Families in Chisinau, Moldova, with the support of the president. So he had asked me to come back, and Moldova is just a beautiful, beautiful country. And the president, Igor Dodon, has made supporting the family one of the key platforms of his presidency. So I was very happy to be there with him and my whole family.
Wow, that's great. Now, I understand they have a prime minister as well, right? So who has the greater power, or is it evenly divided? Because I think the prime minister is a female, and I'm not sure what her political position is. If she's supportive of your ideas, or if there's this kind of ideological back and forth. Did you have any background on that?
Well, that would be a whole long seminar on the history of the differences between the prime minister and the president and the different positions. But just to boil it down to its basics, President Dodon is the head of state for Moldova, but he does not have the same political power as the prime minister. However, and they are from opposing parties,
Right.
which is also quite complicated.
Yeah.
But recently, President Dodon has made great strides in attacking corruption in Moldova, and the prime minister has agreed. And so while they may differ on a lot of issues, there's been more unity around weeding out corruption.
Yeah.
And so we've seen more cooperation in recent years. I would say that while the opposing party may not share publicly and be as forceful as President Dodon, in general, in Moldova, at least publicly, politicians tend to support the natural family. There are a few that don't, but a lot of the bad that occurs happens behind the scenes. So what I love about President Dodon is just his directness, his frankness, and his willing to be publicly a leader on this. And frankly, I think that has played a role in his popularity and his election. The fact that he is so focused on this, and Moldova is seeing what we're seeing around the world, essentially a new form of colonialism where Western quote unquote liberals, I don't actually think that they're liberal, but that's the term that folks use, are trying to import totally alien ideas about family, about life, about a number of different issues. And funders, especially George Soros and the Open Society Foundation, have put literally billions of dollars into very small countries to try and change those countries to look more like a secular, liberal, progressive, in our current understanding of those terms, view. And I think that, again, someone like President Dodon, like the President Orban of Hungary, like like Matteo Salvini in Italy, across the world, we're seeing leaders stand up and say, no, this is not what we're about. The family is too important. And we've been very blessed to be able to work together with leaders like that.
Yeah, that's some interesting stuff you raised there. And, you know, in just talking before the program, I didn't realize you had actually organized here in Trinidad and Tobago. And if you come again, I really look forward to participating.
Oh, it was a great time. We loved it. And it was a regional. The International Organization for the Family hosts every year one World Congress of Families, and that's the biggest event. But there's so much of a desire in different continents to do the same thing that we also do. African Congress of Families or Caribbean Congress of Families, depending on the year, to bring people together from that region. And that's what our event in Trinidad was a few years ago. And we had Caribbean-wide support. We even had folks coming from Latin America and from the United States. And it was a great time. I think people underestimate the importance of just getting people together in the same room to know one another and to realize that many of our challenges are the same. And from that has bloomed a lot of friendships and alliances. I think in the different regions, we've been able to hold these World Congresses.
Yeah, that's excellent. I know there's a very important thing you raised there about new colonialism, because a lot of times intellectuals, they have this view, especially I guess in universities and I guess in the public discourse, that somehow liberals are against imperialism. But it really, I mean, I think especially since the 1990s, there's been this liberal imperialism spreading, perhaps since the end of the Cold War. And And I've definitely come to the conclusion that liberalism is the ideology of imperialism. This global capitalism, this neoliberalism, this corporatism, and also these, LGBTQIA sort of movements. I found it interesting that you had raised that issue. And, on the other hand, there are people who argue, like say from places in Trinidad and Tobago and elsewhere, saying that, things like sodomy laws and laws against homosexuality, that was actually Victorian, Victorian colonial laws that somehow we backward people in the colonies have not outgrown, and we've kept all the old backward laws of colonialism, whereas the mature European liberal democracies have now progressed beyond that, and we should just sort of grow up and throw away our old colonial chains and embrace this new rainbow future.
Right.
What do you say about that? What do you?
Well, I think it's just from trying to be historically accurate and astute and be logical. It makes zero sense, because it's easy to look at any time in history. For example, you bring up the Victorian age. We go back to the 1800s, and people thought they were progressive and advanced and modern. And if we judge the laws of the time by their own standards, everyone at the time would have said, this is what's progressive, this is what's advanced, this is what's modern. But many of those laws, folks today say, no, those are backward, those are absolutely wrong, and in many cases, they're right. But people aren't willing to apply the same logic to our own day. Just, for example, laws that have undermined religious liberty. People try and say, some in the liberal camp, these are advanced, these are modern. Laws that undermine the nature of the family, these are now advanced, these are now modern. You can't say just because something is now that it's the right thing because it is now.
Yeah.
That doesn't follow, because what is now changes throughout human history. The real question is, what is right? What is in the best interest of the common good? And if we want to answer that question, it is important to see that the natural family has been, is now, the best path for a just, free, and truly liberal society. If you go back to what societies and states actually agreed on as the baseline for human rights. Yeah. We hear a lot about human rights, but what did, in the wake of the terror and sadness and evils of World War II, what did nation states who came together to try and actually set a baseline for what human rights actually were? What is the baseline where we agree cultures and nations can be different? We agree that there is that colonialism is wrong when it takes one particular aspect of one society who views itself as advanced and tries to thrust that on another society which has less power. We agree on all that. But I think reasonable people should also agree that there is a baseline for human rights. Slavery is always and everywhere wrong. And so what the world did in the wake of World War II is try and create that baseline. And this is where modern liberals have got things completely wrong. Yeah. Those of us who defend the natural family are defending human rights. Yeah. And we're defending what the nations of the world came together and said human rights were. Article 16 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights makes quite clear that men and women of full age, without any limitation due to race, nationality, and religion, have the right to marry and found a family.
Yeah.
The family, as defined as the union of a man and woman and any children they might bear, is the natural and fundamental group unit of society and is entitled to protection by society and the state. That is the founding document of the United Nations.
Can I just get some clarification from you there? So in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that you're referring to, they define the family in that way? as a man and woman, because I think that's the attack that is being used, that they're now, changing the terms and saying, well, family could be this and that. But in the Universal Declaration, what was the family defined as man and woman and children?
Yes, because the article, so Article 16 has 3 subsections. The first subsection makes clear that it's men and women coming together. Right. And if anyone wants to argue this, you can look at what the actual authors of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights thought, and they thought clearly that what they were doing was defining the family as what everyone at the time understood it to be, which is the union of a man and a woman in marriage with any children that they might bear. And Article 16 says even more, that unit is entitled to protection by society and the state.
Yeah, I'm just verifying. Yeah, men and women of full age, as you said, you rattled it off correctly. You have that memorized. Great. Yeah, men and women of full age without any limitation due to race, nationality, or religion have the right to marry and found a family. Exactly as you said. Correct. Yeah.
Well, so now what's happened is this baseline of what everyone agreed on in the wake of World War II, we're now being told that people who believe in this baseline human right are now bigots, haters, outside the norm of civilized society. There's something fundamentally wrong. Yeah. What folks have done is turn human rights on their head. Yeah. And I think that those of us who believe in the importance of the family, it's sometimes a tough road, but we always have to remember, we're the ones standing up for the defense of human rights. We're the ones standing for the defense of what is natural and good for human society. Yeah. And we're the ones standing for something universal. What I mean here is, we're not trying to impose an alien ideology on different countries. This was what countries came together and all agreed on not that long ago. Yeah. It's those who come into countries and say, you can't have differences with our country when it comes to recognizing a certain form of family. That's now the language that we hear, is that we defend the natural family, and the reason we use natural family is because it's in this Article 16, that we are somehow imposing one vision of the family. Well, correct. This vision of the family, it is right, it is true, and it's what the world came together to agree on when it agreed on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And
I think you're making some amazing points there, and especially turning the argument around, because whereas defenders of the natural family are being put on the back foot all the time, being put in a defensive position, you're the way you've articulated it, I think is so smart that you are the one standing up for universalism and not a particular culture imposing, and a particular vanguard of some advanced liberalism imposing it on the others, and that you're standing up for what people agree to. Could I ask you something about your own background? How did you get involved in this? What is your background?
Well, I was born and raised in outside of Los Angeles, California, not in a particularly conservative place. Yeah. But I, from my own family, from my own upbringing, and especially as I got into university, I went to first UCLA, and then I was in Oxford in England, and I realized I was surrounded by people that were quite smart in many ways, but totally had a different vision of what it means to be a human being. What I mean here is that on life, on family, on faith, I was basically surrounded by very smart people who had a totally different view of these things. And so I tried to spend a lot of time going back and looking at the history of ideas of how we got to this place. And I'm bringing up the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That's important. But all of this.
What did you study, by the way?
I studied history.
Great.
Yeah, I planned on being a history professor, but part of the story is after I left Oxford, I got a degree at Oxford. I went back to UCLA, and I was thinking about being a history professor. I got more and more interested in not just the ideas, but if these ideas are true, where are the people around the world trying to stand up and defend them? And there were people, I saw that, but it seemed like it was David and Goliath, and I wanted to be involved in this. I wanted to make a difference, so I devoted myself to that, and I ended up heading a number of different organizations that were pro-life, pro-family, until ultimately I was asked to take over as president of the International Organization of the Family. And so that's how.
So you came from an intellectual perspective rather than a church-based path. Is that fair to say?
Well, yeah, I think it went hand in hand for me. My faith was always important, but I always thought that reason and faith should, if they're correct, they should follow the same path.
Exactly. There's no contradiction.
Right. So I was active in the World Congress of Families and the International Organization for the Family before I was ever, asked to be president. I went to all these World Congresses, and I said, this is exactly what we need, because what you see there are the differences, beautiful differences. The fact that, we have something to learn from one another, different, cultures, different traditions, different religions. And people weren't just sort of leaving their religion aside. They were saying, look, we have real disagreements, but we have Catholics, Protestants, Jews, Muslims, anyone who believes in the family coming together. And while we have differences in religion, let's unite around what we share. And that was, and is, the family. So that really inspired me.
Yeah, and I really want to touch a bit more on your sort of intellectual background, because that's interesting to me. So you're at UCLA, you're at Oxford. I'm not sure what years you were there, but Michel Foucault was writing around in the 70s and 80s, and then he became huge, like a cult figure.
Right.
And his whole history of sexuality, that's like the Bible for this whole movement. I mean, he is like their godhead figure. I mean, it's have you ever sought to engage with that intellectually at all?
Well, yeah, because my time, especially at UCLA, there was less of that at Oxford. Oxford had not, and I think things have probably somewhat changed, but at the time there was a certain rigor to life at Oxford where the newest fad wasn't going to, it wasn't
everything
over. Yeah. But at UCLA, I distinctly remember going through our reading list and thinking, look, this is about us becoming historians. And fair enough, we should read philosophers from different points of view to inform our study of history. But I realized very quickly, it's all coming from one side.
Yeah.
It wasn't as if there was any intellectual diversity in this. We weren't reading, say, Thomas Aquinas or Bossuet's view of history. It was all the Frankfurt School, Foucault, Derrida, and all the rest.
Yeah.
And so I realized, it doesn't take a lot when you're in an environment where it's so clearly one-sided, that if you have even a little bit of and I think this is good, a little bit of a good rebellion in you, where you're, I don't want to go with the flow. I want to try. I want to understand different points of view. That you realize that some of it is, I hate to say this because I have a huge respect for education, but the way that education is currently constructed in the West, especially in many of the most elite schools, is it really is one side.
Yeah.
And I didn't want to have only one side. So I tried to read as many other authors from a more, for lack of a better term, conservative tradition. And what I found was, the great irony was that because so much of modern philosophy has on the political left
Yeah.
has been informed by Nietzsche and Nietzsche's sons and daughters in the Frankfurt School, that in many ways it's quite illiberal. Even though it takes the term liberal,
Yeah.
it's very focused on, because it tries to deny the reality of any real objective truth, it's quite willing to take someone's personal truth and impose it on everyone else through the will to power.
Yeah.
And the conservatives that I read were quite less, were much less authoritarian. There was a lot less of that and much more of, look, we need a baseline of moral goods that human societies can have agreement on and defend. But outside of these baseline moral goods, there's heterogeneity, difference, distinction. There's a variety of life, and instead of trying to get rid of that, we should embrace it.
Yeah, in my own experience, it was the same thing. I mean, when I, just going through the normal, I went to the University of Toronto and for my undergrad degree, and my whole life going through the education system in Canada, it was totally liberal, and the whole sort of popular culture idea is so liberal, and it's that conservatives are stupid. They don't read books. They just read the popular press. They look at sports, and they're not interested in the world. And if you are intelligent and sophisticated, you're obviously going to be liberal. And that was the prejudice I grew up with and understood. And when I did my PhD in England at the University of Hull, we had Noel Sullivan was in my department. He was like the leading conservative thinker in England. And I couldn't believe all this knowledge that was kind of hidden from me that I didn't know. I didn't know what these thinkers were saying. And I just discovered a whole world. And I was so angry. I was so angry that this had been, hidden from me essentially. It is a similar type of thing. And what's interesting about there's a great collection. I think Mueller is his name. Conservative readers, because of the specificity of conservatism, it's far more heterogeneous, as you say, because they're looking at like German conservatism is totally different from English conservatism or American conservatism or French and so forth. Yeah. So I mean, I'm very interested in that intellectual journey you made. I see a lot of parallel discoveries there, and so that's very interesting the way you bring this in, because what I find interesting, really interesting and important about the International Organization of the Family is two things which are fantastic. One is that you organize at a very high level politically and organizationally and institutionally with the UN, and you have your world conferences, and then you're networking with different political leaders and so forth, and legislatures. And then on the other hand, you have a very interesting, solid body of ideas that are substantial, and it's not just based on, well, this is what I believe, and I have the right to believe it, and it's a lot. You're taking the argument further. So could you just go through the activities? I see on your website you have 4 activities here that the International Organization of the Family does. Can you go over that for us?
Yes. Number one, we've already discussed. We have our World Congress of Families every year, and the Regional Congress of Families. Number 2, we have what we call the Article 16 initiative. Article 16 is what we were discussing earlier, the article in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that makes clear the importance of the natural family. And that is all of our efforts, especially at the United Nations, but at other international bodies, to make sure that the natural family is protected and respected in discussions. That is a huge effort, and I have to say, at times, we are losing on this. I mean, we are doing the best we can, but we are seeing, again, billions of dollars being spent to try and undermine the natural life at the at inner bodies. But we have some victories. We continue to fight, and there are more and more countries that we're working with that are willing to take a step and lead on this. So that's quite important. We also have the Natural Family Journal, which is a more academic journal that we produce quarterly, that brings different ideas to the table, and we're right now in the middle of expanding that to have a new website and try and have more access, more languages. Then we also have the Emerging Leaders Program, which is for young people. We try and help young people to get to World Congresses and try and nurture them and help them in their different countries. We have some new programs that we're just beginning. We're working on. In a few months, we'll launch our own pro-family news site, because there's what we've realized from all of these congresses is that there is so much animosity to what we're doing right now that it's very hard to get any fair shake in the press. So we're going to have our own news network that is truly global. It'll be in multiple languages, and it'll be online. But what we want to try and do is that there is a lot of bad news, but there's also a lot of good news around the world. Yeah. People, it's easy for people to get sort of depressed that it is a David and Goliath battle at times, and especially if you're living in New York or San Francisco or Los Angeles, there's a tendency to start thinking, well, I'm really all alone. We're not all alone. Yeah. And what the great thing that I hear from people going to the World Congresses is, I just cannot believe that there are so many people that think like me from around the world, and it inspires people. So the news network, we want to be able to tell this good news and bad news, but the good news from around the world, and make people more aware that great things are happening, and that this isn't a lost cause. There's no truly lost cause. It's just in certain times and places, causes are more difficult or less difficult. Yeah. So that will be our new project. We're really excited about that, and in December we'll launch that. Yeah. When I started out in sort of activism, I think I've always had the sympathy for the underdog, and and I started out on the left, in the 1980s, and then I slowly made a switch over. And I mean, and in many ways, I mean, for those with these sort of underdog sympathies, I mean, this battle for the natural family, that's the underdog position, and totally. And that's a super. I mean, it's so important to understand. For example, President Dodon is a socialist. Yeah. Look, we are united around the family and life, and a very basic understanding of what it means to be a human being. That, by the way, the majority of human beings across the world share our view. Just because some countries in Europe and the United States, for example, have, and in the U.S. it was through the courts, not through any sort of popular will or democratic action, redefined marriage, it does not mean that the people around the world share this new vision. That's right. And so the great irony right now is that what I see is that we are standing up for the little guy, and that it is the elites that are most willing to attack and undermine and go against the voice of the people around the world. And so I'm a big fan of G.K. Chesterton, who always talks about paradox. Yeah. And the great paradox of modern times is that those who are called conservative are in many ways the most liberal, and those that are called liberal are in many ways the most conservative. Exactly. It depends on what you use those terms for. And instead, I think that looking at this from the perspective of pro-family, pro-life, pro-human, in some ways that's a better way to look at the distinction, because we just saw in, for example, the Netherlands, someone was just older woman was just euthanized against her will, and a court said that's fine. Is that really pro-human? Is that human rights?
Yeah.
Or in the United States, people are looking up and seeing that a videographer or a wedding hall can't live by their religious beliefs. Is that really pro-human, that you would undermine basic religious liberty? So all of the terms are really that examine who is for the little guy, who is for the voice of your average American or person down the street in a country like Trinidad or in Hungary. Again, it doesn't mean that the majority is always right, but let's not have a pretension that modern secular liberals give much of a hoot about what the average person thinks. As soon as the average person says, "Hey, I don't think we should allow abortion in our country," or "Hey, I don't think I think marriage there's something unique and special about mothers and fathers, that they're not the same, and that they're both equal, but you can't say that it's the exact same thing, and therefore I think that male and female are important to children, important to humanity. So I believe in, I don't want to attack anyone, but I believe in marriage as the union of a man and woman." Immediately that person's attacked.
That's right.
And so
it's quite amazing.
Yeah,
as you're saying, the liberals who like to say they're I don't know, the champion of the people. I don't even know if they say that anymore. They used to, definitely. And but they are the one. I mean, they base their, whether it be for Trump voters or whether it be Brexit voters or where, they base their whole ideology on demonizing ordinary, uneducated hicks. They are so, I mean, elitist is the common word that's used for it, which is correct. I mean, they just look down their noses at ordinary people, and with such contempt.
Exactly.
Palpable,
Yeah.
I mean,
again, this is, you put your finger on it, because typically in every day and age in most societies there is some elite or aristocracy, but for different societies at different times, even that have great differences in language and culture, typically that aristocracy, whether it's in a tribal society or in a more feudal society, for example, in Europe in the medieval period, there are certain obligations that are attached to aristocracy. Now, I'm not defending that aristocracy during the 1500s didn't do bad things, but what I am saying is there was at least an understanding on the part of aristocrats that they were, one, a part of an aristocracy, and two, that while they had certain rights that others didn't have, they also had certain obligations.
That's right. Noblesse oblige. That's right.
Yeah, and you see that in, again, I mentioned tribal societies, whether in Africa or in Native Americans here, that tribal elders would have certain, there were certain things that they were expected to do that were obligations, others were not. Now, fast forward to the present, we have a highly urban, typically well-educated elite running most of our major institutions, whether in academia or in business. They tend to share a certain perspective on the nature of reality. And by any other measure, if you were sort of an alien that just plopped into this time and place and you were familiar with aristocracies and other days and ages, you would say they're aristocrats.
Yeah.
But the thing about today is that they don't understand themselves to be aristocrats. They don't necessarily understand themselves to be a part of a particular unique type of order, and they don't see themselves having necessarily particular obligations to others.
Yeah.
And so while in aristocrats had contempt for those beneath them, our modern contempt for those beneath them without even understanding that they might have certain and they don't see themselves of order. They don't. So you have a lot of the bad side of elitism, contempt for those beneath you, a sort of sneering, jeering view of the unwashed masses.
Yeah, the hoi polloi.
But you don't have the sort of, and I think in the West particularly, it was informed by Christianity.
Yeah.
The virtue of humility, where you may see yourselves as a part of a higher order, but you have an obligation to everyone else.
That's right.
So that is why I think that we have sort of an unchecked elite that is far more willing to impose its views on others than other types of elites in past ages. They don't even see what they're doing as wrong.
Interesting.
And now, whether you're in Africa or the United States, there's a certain group of elites that have NGOs underneath them. They have businesses that basically sneer and say, look, the people of Africa may think this, but what they really need are these textbooks on that include LGBTQIA and have an emphasis on planning, because these people are just having too many children.
That's right.
And they need to know better. And I mean, how prideful can you be?
Yeah.
And that's what we see everywhere. You see it in Africa, you see it in Latin America, you see it in the United States.
That's a really interesting insight you have there that I'd like to extend and build on, because you talk about this elite who are, totally unmoored by any sense of social responsibility, totally selfish, totally self-centered, and contemptuous, and imposing their view on others, which ties into the whole imperial idea. I remember when I was young, and we used to read in school about the Roman Empire and the decadence, and the stuff you used to read, it's like, wow, could this ever be true? But now I think when you live real life, it's like, my God, that was tame as opposed to what we're seeing now. Like when you go through Times Square, I was there this summer, and these huge billboards of, men kissing, and, it's just normal stuff and up there. And I mean, it's the idea of decadence. I think that's probably what you've outlined there is probably a good definition of decadence. It's when the elite have no sense of responsibility, and then they take their sexual predilections and perversions and generalize it and impose it on the masses. That's really what it seems is happening. This whole movement is related to some sort of cultural decadence. This is from a historian type of perspective. I'm looking at it. I don't know what you think about that.
Well, I think that it's worse than that. I think that if you look at, classic histories, of the fall of civilizations, whether you agree with a lot of what they say or not, often what you're seeing, especially in the case of Rome, is there's at least some pretense or faking it to believe in the old gods, and then you go about your business doing what you know is
That's
wrong.
Right.
But what's worse about what the distinction, I think, our own age, is that modern secular liberals seem to be fueled by a religious And so it isn't simply self-interest alone, as I don't think that cultures that are Christian can ever, well, I think it's difficult for them to ever completely forget that there was Christianity.
Yeah.
Instead, what they do is take the norms and orthodoxy that was Christianity, and they make a new religion with the same sort of fervor, but applied to totally unchristian ends.
Yeah, and if you don't mind, I'd like to interrupt, because that's a very important insight, and because I see people like Richard Dawkins, for example, or maybe Christopher Hitchens, right? They are atheists, yes, but they are zealots, as you said. They have all the zeal of a recent convert to atheism, and they are post-Christian, very specifically post-Christian, in the sense that many times their criticism of God is that God is not Christian enough, right? So that he causes too much suffering, that he's not merciful enough. They wish God were more merciful and loving than he actually is, because they see the world as too cruel for there ever to even be a God. And so it's very much along the lines of what you're saying, I think. I don't know if you agree that it's...
Oh, I 100% agree. I mean, I was very deeply affected by Alistair McIntyre's work, and Alistair McIntyre goes... Yeah, I mean, McIntyre goes into this whole, from, After Virtue is the beginning, but he has these 3 books that go through sort of how we got to this point in our ability to have any sort of moral community.
Yeah.
And I think one thing that's important is what you're pointing to, is that the secular West, which has now extended its tentacles largely over the whole world, it is not it's not properly understood as anti-Christian, but post-Christian, taking a lot of the virtue of Christianity and reapplying them to the wrong ends. Yeah. So, this is the key point to understand when you face some of these just angry but absolutely motivated organizations trying to undermine life. If you look at Planned Parenthood, there's almost a religious devotion to the notion that they are defending human rights.
Yeah.
And the need, unlike the ancient pagans, to philosophically defend the practice on what are largely Christian terms. Now, that can never be done. I don't agree with it. But instead of an ancient pagan who was willing to take children and leave them out, simply saying, well, this is a lesser human, he's not physically as good as he should be, therefore it's okay for us. We need to hear about how abortion is a positive choice because it allows human freedom on the part of the mother. That this is actually a great good because it allows for people to live better, more fruitful, more productive lives. We see all of these philosophical...
They try to out-moralize the Christians.
Right.
Unlike, say, Marquis de Sade or those 17th or 18th century atheists who said, all right, well, if there's no God, then therefore there's no evil, and I can do whatever I want. But instead, this group of atheists are saying they are more moral than Christians. It's interesting.
I mean, we're getting pretty deep into the philosophy of this, but I think it also extends itself to a new form of sacramental theology. What I mean here is that there are almost rites and sacraments of secular liberalism. The need on the part of liberals, secular liberals, to punish those who transgress the boundaries of their new orthodoxy. So, for example, it's not okay to say live and let live when Chick-fil-A the owners of Chick-fil-A say that they believe marriage is the union of a man and a woman.
Mm-hmm.
It's not okay to have the old liberal idea that, okay, we disagree, but we'll agree to disagree, and we don't want to destroy you.
Yeah.
Instead, we must destroy Chick-fil-A. They will not be allowed. There's a public display of making clear the boundaries of orthodoxy. San Antonio will not allow Chick-fil-A to be in our city, and there's all this language of virtue, of human rights, but it's all about making a public display of a new, and as I will say, false religion of tolerance, of acceptance. And again, it's not about tolerance and acceptance. That's the public language that's used, but those that don't accept the new orthodoxy must be punished.
Right. That's a great phrase you use about it. It's a sacrament. You're right. It's a sacrament in a new religion. So here we are faced with this, with this, ideology, this motivation, and your organization has been doing a lot of amazing work. And I think because of your deep understanding, which you're displaying here, that explains why you've been organizing at the UN level, at the intellectual level, at the political level. Now, at the UN, I was very interested to see of your work there. Doug Clark, you mentioned, is the director of your UN and international policy. Prepared a statement on the upcoming events, which I think is starting today, which is the 17th of September. We're recording this, and sending it out to 193 ambassadors. Could you just describe some of that work a little more?
Well, I think that a lot of folks around the world are going, we're busy, we're living our lives, we're raising our families, and may not realize, how much is happening at the United Nations that can directly affect what goes on in their country. It seems so far away. And one of the things that's most clear is the UN has certain goals that it sets for itself in different areas of life. And member states, the majority of states, 183 or so countries, come to try and hand out some agreement on what the goals are over maybe 5, 10, 15 years. What's going on right now is the Sustainable Development Goals. And a lot of what's happening is sustainable development sounds as if it's a relatively unloaded term. It just sustainable development. What does that mean? Oh, it means, well, we want to make sure that countries are able to advance economically in a sustainable way. But what's ended up happening is that no matter what the topic is, sustainable development's a perfect example. That those who want to advance abortion and redefining the family attempt to use these meetings to put into the UN new rights claims, new claims about what the nature of the family is. And so what Doug Clark and our team has done is to make clear that throughout its history, the United Nations has viewed the family as the strongest engine for sustainable development and the strongest engine for economic growth and for the good of human societies. And what we don't want to occur are attempts to redefine the family and impose that on folks, but also to not give adequate protection or weight to the family. Both those things are occurring. What I mean is, because the family unfortunately become a contested subject, you have some of the groups attempting to basically get rid of or minimize the idea of the family at all. At the same token, they're trying to change the way that the family is viewed. And what we want to make clear to the countries of the world is the importance of the family in safeguarding human rights, and the importance of the family of being the cradle in which economics, virtues, everything is learned, and not taking away the importance of mothers and fathers, husbands and wives, fathers and mothers to children, and trying to replace that somehow with the state.
Yeah, that's really important work you're doing there. And I was interested in looking over your website and your review of activities at, I think it was August 26th to 28th this year, Salt Lake City. There was the United Nations Civil Society Conference. Is that correct?
Right, we were there.
Right, and that's interesting. Kate, you mentioned Katie Faust, the founder of Them Before Us. She was asking them, I suppose the delegates there, if you could solve one of these problems, which one would it be? And she had poverty, addiction, behavioral disorders, poor performance in school, rape, incarceration rates, homelessness, or suicide. And she pointed out that basically fatherlessness, if you tackle the problem of fatherlessness, you tackle all these problems simultaneously, which is really important information, because I see, you have that, you have things like, what's it called here? The Sustainable Development Goals, which used to be the Millennium Development Goals. The tremendous research that exists, that appears it's being suppressed by the media, about the importance of the family in all these things, success in schools, them getting out of poverty, so very, very real. It's not just the ideology of the family, which is important in itself, but it's an ideological, philosophical battle. But there are very real policy implications from this. Can you expand a bit on that for me?
Yeah, I mean, you refer back to the Salt Lake City Civil Society Conference again in Salt Lake. The interesting thing about that is that the Civil Society Conference, that's the first time that it has been held outside of New York City, and it was quite an important event. What it tries to do, and I think the goal is good, is to lift up the importance of civil society, of all of the ways that we interact with one another that are outside of government. That all of the what Alexis de Tocqueville called the sort of intermediate institutions. And again, it's good that there is a focus on this, but I do have to say that civil society in the West is in big trouble. And I'm not sure that there's any real way or easy way to bring it back. And the reason is quite simple. In the past, Americans agreed on basic foundational premises. There was certain agreement, even if one person was Catholic, one person was Protestant, on the importance of God and the understanding of morality in public life. There were certain understanding that judges should not be the ones ruling in our political life. There were certain just basic norms where you could go and watch a football game and it wouldn't be politicized.
Yeah.
But what has occurred, and the reason that civil society is so fractured, is because we don't have that agreement anymore.
Yeah.
Now, instead of saying, well, let's agree to disagree and focus on something else, we have Antifa attacking people who stand up for traditional marriage, beating them. I've been physically assaulted during Proposition 8 in California. There was a felony for someone attacking me just putting up signs. Now, I'm not crying about it. I'm a big boy.
Yeah.
I'm not trying to elicit sympathy either. I'm just saying this is the fundamental reality of where we are as a country. When we did a bus that simply said, boys are boys, girls are girls. Don't redefine the nature of what it means to be a boy and a girl. And we had this all over New York City. The windows were busted. Our bus driver was attacked. We had to have a police presence guarding us around Yale. This is something very new and dangerous in American society. And what it points to is that civil society is largely has broken down. Now, of course, we still have some protection to our property, and the police are still there. But it doesn't take long to have societies fail once there's no longer any point of agreement on what the purpose of society is.
Yeah.
And that, I think, is why our politics are so fractured, why there's such a feeling of mistrust on the part of citizens. And really, if you were going to write a history of this, I think it is connected with what occurred in Proposition 8, where, across, not just in California, but in state after state, Americans voted in 33 states to define marriage as the union of a man and a woman. They went to that place where they think Americans believe is sacrosanct, the voting booth. They voted. They said this is true, and then you just have judges come in and strip it away.
Yeah.
You can't do that without people feeling alienated. Then we see Brexit. Whether you like Trump or not, Trump was elected. People voted for him. And you see people being physically attacked for wearing their red Make America Great hats. And you see attempts to, from the beginning, have, say that the people who voted for Trump are just stupid.
Yeah.
And this is what occurred with Brexit. This process is accelerating, and the divisions are more deep. And unlike in past times, although there have been times in American history where the country is absolutely divided, but that has not been the norm. What we have now is a division that is so deep and based so much on first principles that it is now expanded to other countries. And it, unlike it being over in the past, it may not, divisions over parties weren't necessarily divisions over first principles. Again, at times they were. The Civil War was obviously a division over first principle, but it was a horrific time in American history, and luckily a vision of the future that was better ended up winning. Yeah. But what I'm trying to say is that now the divisions are civilizational in nature. They're over first principles. They've expanded beyond the United States, and I don't necessarily see any path for those to go away because in any time soon, because they're over the key premises of public life. If for example, Brexit doesn't move forward in some way, I think the British will also see that our votes really don't count, and that sort of alienation is not good for a country, not good for a society. Absolutely,
I totally agree with you. And I suppose this is why your organization also focuses on politics a lot. But I find that interesting. And the politics that are going on today, I find it so fascinating because, as I said, I originally, came from the left, and a quite radical left. And I don't think I abandoned my principles at all. It's just that the context has changed so much, and because I'm still for the ordinary little guy, but it's just the left is not there anymore. And so when I look at your program too, let's say in the 1980s when I was on the left, and then you had this sort of moral majority and the Reaganites and the neocons, and they kind of were all together, and you had these stereotypes about what the right wing was. It doesn't really hold up at all on analysis though. But that was a stereotype. And when I look at some of your your points in the Verona Declaration, which is a very interesting document that I think last year or maybe earlier this year you had passed. You have some very, it's not the typical, conservative Christian stereotype that would be there. There's a lot of nuanced positions there, some which might even be considered critical of, capitalism. Like when you talk about things like sustainable economic development is not possible without reaffirming the profound link that must exist between economics and morality. Right? I mean, the sort of pure free market profit motive, you're not in support of that, which is very interesting and important, I think. And there's a very interesting paragraph here you have about, at the same time, a human society disjointed and deprived of intermediate bodies like the family would result in a mass of obedient, servile consumers who would not recognize their roots and traditions, and as such would be more easily be manipulated by those powers who would exploit them for profit. Again, that's something that I think so many people on the left would identify with, that don't want to be part of this corporatist, consumerist society where the dollar is everything and corporate power. And so a lot of time, the things that people on the left say they stand for, in fact, when you have George Soros and the Wall Street bankers and they're supporting you, the largest corporations in the world are supporting you, and you're fighting against, people on the left are fighting against organizations like yourself that are talking about, the human being standing up against being a mere consumer. And where economics has to be profoundly directed by morality. These subtleties are lost in the stereotyped debate. And when when people like Trump are seen as just a racist, or Matteo Salvini, I just think it's such an unfortunate caricature of what's going on right now. I don't know. Do you want to expand on that a bit for me? Some of the points I raised there.
Yeah, I think that. I think that this is we're only at the beginning of having folks really understand the paradigm shift that's occurring in the world, especially related to what is the nature of conservatism, or what is the nature of those folks who don't accept the new secular liberal order. And what I mean is, you have to go back, I think, in history to begin to understand this, and very little of this has been done. Modern, like 1980s conservatism sort of emerged out of a union of pro-family, traditional Americans, like you brought up the moral majority, in foreign policy, anti-communist, against especially the power of the Soviet Union and how it was demeaning the human person, but also a third sort of rail, which is more libertarian economics, the free market. And I think because of the threat of the Soviet Union, all three of those different groups, which had disagreements, those disagreements were sort of pushed aside because there was such agreement about the threat of communism to the world.
Yeah.
And I think that that's accurate. I think that communism was a threat. But with the fall of the Soviet Union, something new began to emerge, and the internal differences between, say, radical libertarians and more traditional Americans began to emerge. And at the same time, corporations, which in the past had been more willing to cater to the ideas of the sort of middle America, the largely Protestant but also Catholic, uh, majority of Americans who shared certain basic understandings of the importance of religion and morality. That started to break down. And by, after Proposition 8 and during Proposition 8, what we saw, and this is just a somewhat arbitrary point, but it's not completely arbitrary, we increasingly saw corporations willingly embrace secular liberalism, willingly embrace a new vision of man, willingly say, we don't care what a majority of the consumers think. This is a more enlightened vision, and we're going to push it. So I think at that point, some Americans began to reconsider this alliance, that Wall Street clearly was no longer in the interest of supporting traditional morality. All it cared about, it said what it cared about was the bottom line, but it seemed to care even more about being perceived as progressive. Mm-hmm. And even if a majority of consumers didn't agree, they thought they could get their way. And that's what I mean when I said earlier, it's almost like a religion. They say that they're for the profit motive, but when the profit motive versus being perceived as progressive in New York, San Francisco, and Los Angeles was in conflict, they chose to be perceived as more progressive.
Yeah.
So all of this has occurred, and I think that there is a period now of realignment. And it's very early in this, and that people are starting to reconsider and think about and question whether the best interest of Wall Street is the best interest of middle Americans. And I think that at times the answer to that has to be no. And so I think that's what you're touching on. And for me, again, there are a variety. The International Organization for the Family has partners in countries that have great differences in the way that their economy is structured. Now, of course, we believe in the human person and the importance of the family, and therefore there has to be free enterprise. People are not slaves. Mm-hmm. But the way that countries do that could be different from country to country. So as we brought up earlier, you have a socialist, Igor Dodon, who still believes firmly in the free market, and we have people who are on the political right. But what they agree on is the importance of the family, and that the economy, and this is critical, should serve the family rather than the family serving the corporations and the economy.
Absolutely.
And so, again, you can't lay out a cookie cutter mm-hmm. solution for every country, but I would say that we're pretty liberal in the sense of many different economic orders. As long as they're not totalitarian or authoritarian, they can exist. And and still serve the family. But what I would not agree with anymore is that right now in the West, that our concentration of wealth and power in our corporations, that those corporations any longer have any desire to defend the family, basic morality, or voters' views that contradict that of, say, the Human Rights Campaign or the LGBTQ groups. Most of the corporations have completely thrown their weight behind them, and that's why we find ourselves, struggling to fundraise anywhere near the point of the other side, because Human Rights Campaign's getting Fortune 500 companies are just dumping their money to support them, whereas those same corporations would never support us in any way.
Yeah, that's incredible. Well, I mean, I've kept you a long time. We've had a great discussion. I could keep you for hours more, but
I'm glad to do it. It's been great.
Yeah, I mean, and you've more than satisfied me with the intellectual depth you bring to this, because when I looked at your program, I knew there was something more. This was not just instinctive. you had some really deep thought that informs the way you do things and why you do it. So I mean, hopefully we can, you know, continue the discussion at another time. But in closing, let's try to sort of bring it, summarize things. I mean, what would you? I mean, you're doing so many things. What would you say is the main message you want to put out in the world, really, if you had to distill it?
Well, you're not alone if you believe in the natural family, and that we need to unite together. People should visit profam.org, learn more about what we're doing. If they don't want to join, with us, there are many good pro-family organizations that we partner with in different countries. Do something, but don't feel like that you're alone and that there's no way to stand for your beliefs. Every little thing that you do to stand for the truth matters, and we have an obligation, even in the most difficult times, to stand for what we know is true. So that to me is the most important thing, to understand that we are not alone, that those of us who believe in the natural family are defending a core human right, and that we need to do more to advance this cause.
Excellent. So that's profam.org. I'll
Yes.
put the link in the description, and I encourage everybody to visit and to donate to your organization as well. Now I know, I mean, we've been talking a lot about theory and stuff, but you guys are very practical as well. I mean, about policy, and you're engaged in a lot of petitions and lobbying and legislation, and trying to influence legislation and so forth, including the Equality Act. I know you guys are dealing with that. So what would you say right now, sort of your main practical goal is in the immediate future? I know you've got a lot of them, but what's the main battle you're trying to sort of win right now?
Well, you brought up the Equality Act. In the United States, the Equality Act would basically be the death of some core First Amendment rights that we have, some human rights that we have, freedom of association, freedom of religion. This Equality Act basically says that people can be punished for believing and acting on the belief that marriage is the union of a man and a woman. So we have a petition that we are supporting on that. On a broader level, we're preparing for this Ghana World Congress of Families November 1st, and we are working on our next World Congress will be in 2020. It likely will be in Latin America, and we're working to make that a reality.
No, that's great. That's great. Now, at a personal level, I mean, you talked about, you know, that you've actually been physically attacked in this. You've talked about how, you know, it sometimes seems like a losing battle. These things are important for, at a human level, as I said, in terms of people who want to get involved in these things, and you know, there's some sort of inspiration that must be pushing you forward when you're faced with all these challenges, physically and morally. What is it, just to share with the listeners, what is it that really inspires you to go forward, despite, you know, sometimes when things look hopeless, or you know, when you're scared because, you know, people might want to be, you know, physically attacking you? What is it that inspires you? I find this a very interesting thing when I talk to different people.
Well, I have 9 children, so and my wife and I have seen a lot as far in our own lives about trying, even doing the best we can as far as being in religious schools, the power that's being exerted to try and change children's view of the family and of religion and of the importance of life. And so seeing this in our own lives, obviously that's motivating. And again, we are an interreligious organization, but I myself am Catholic, and I know what my church teaches. I know what Christ taught, and one thing is that if you stand for the truth, there's a pretty high likelihood that you're going to get attacked.
Yeah.
And instead of holding that as something to avoid at all costs, we should, and this is hard, but we should embrace it and be thankful. So, again, there are people that are not Christian. There are people of many different faiths that are a part of what we do, but they have their religious freedom. I have mine.
Yeah.
And I know that they're motivated by, that's one great thing, is that when it comes to the family, there is such unity among the major world religions.
Yeah.
And so, I meet people all the time that are motivated from a deep part of their faith, even though they don't share the same faith I do. I have utter respect for them. So but that's where it comes for me, is that the more vicious at times our opponents have gotten, the more I realize what's at stake and why we can't give up.
Yeah. No, I mean, I was raised a Catholic, but I'm Hindu, but I still have tremendous respect for the Catholic faith. And I think, the story of Jesus and the lesson of suffering, and I think the Catholic faith is has extremely important lessons for everybody in terms of that, and obviously I think it still stays with me definitely in terms of understanding the truth and suffering and fighting for what's right. So no need to be apologetic about that at all. And so for any young people listening right now who are getting these messages in the music, at school, on TV and cartoons and all this stuff now, I mean, what would you recommend to young people listening to this, who may have questions or who actually may think we're crazy?
Well, I mean, my advice would be very simple. Don't just be a product of your own age. Don't just be whatever the powers that be say at any given time and place. You are made for more than this. And what that means is, in a day and age where all of the centers of power are telling you one thing, those that really want to question will question that one thing. And right now, that one thing tends to be the total agreement that the natural family is not something that should be protected or supported. So question that, think about that, read about that, and I think you'll see that as I said in the beginning of this, that the real rebels today are not the LGBTQ folks. They control everything.
Yeah.
They're that I may be going too far saying controlling everything, but if you look at what the corporations, academic, all centers of power are rallying around a certain perspective. If you believe in true human rights, question that. Think about other perspectives. Realize that those of us who disagree do not do so out of hate, by and large. I know I don't. That it's out of a love for something that is a natural good, a beautiful thing, and that is that there's something unique and special about men and women coming together to form a family.
Yeah, definitely. And finally, you have any plans in the next 5 years or so that you want to talk about at all? I know you have the Congress coming up in November. You're talking about the World Congress, but anything you want to just bring attention to?
Yeah, well, my hope in 5 years is that we'll be able to have multiple congresses around the world, focusing on all of the continents of the world, because the desire is there. And I know we could do it, but we need to grow to be able to do it. Secondly, in 5 years, we want the news network that we're now creating to be truly a global news network that allows people to get news that they can trust from a perspective that they agree with. And I don't think that that exists right now.
That's excellent.
Number three is, and finally, that our work in the United Nations would be greatly expanded, and that we could turn the United Nations back to understanding the family as it originally was understood in the founding documents of the United Nations. So those are the three major goals.
Yeah. Well, those are important goals, and I certainly do, wish you luck in that, and I would offer whatever support I can as well, if at all possible. But I want to thank you, Brian, so much, not only for this interview, but for all your work, your determination, your organizational skills, your intelligence, your vision. It's all extremely important.
Thank you so much. It's great to be on.
Yeah. And so I wish you and the International Organization of the Family all the very best and every success in your struggles ahead. So thanks very much. That's all for Independent Thought and Freedom this week. Please join us again next week. And in the meanwhile, make sure you subscribe, leave me a rating, like and share this podcast with your friends. Thanks, and bye for now.